Research Analysis Corporation. This is Humro's sister, 1,984 inches organization situated in McLean, Virginia. Established in 1948, it was taken over by the Committee of 300 in 1961 when it became part of the Johns Hopkins block. It has worked on over 600 projects, including integrating Negroes into the Army, the tactical use of nuclear weapons, psychological warfare programs, and mass population control. Obviously, there are many more major think tanks, and we shall come to most of them in this book. One of the most important areas of cooperation between what think tanks turn out and what becomes government and public policy are the pollsters. It is the job of the polling companies to mold and shape public opinion in the way that suits the conspirators. Polls are constantly being taken by CBS, NBC, ABC, The New York Times, The Washington Post. Most of these efforts are coordinated at the National Opinion Research Center, where, as much as it will amaze most of us, a psychological profile was developed for the entire nation. Findings are fed into the computers of Gallup Poll and Yankelovich, Skelly, and White for comparative evaluation. Much of what we read in our newspapers or see on television has first been cleared by the polling companies. What we see is what the pollsters think we should see. This is called public opinion making. The whole idea behind this bit of social conditioning is to find out how responsive the public is to policy directives handed down by the Committee of 300. We are called targeted population groups, and what is measured by the pollsters is how much resistance is generated to what appears in the nightly news. Later, we shall learn exactly how this deceptive practice got started and who is responsible for it. It is all part of the elaborate opinion-making process created at Tavistock. Today, our people believe they are well-informed, but what they do not realize is that the opinions they believe are their own were in fact created in the research institutions and think tanks of America, and that none of us are free to form our own opinions because of the information we are provided with by the media and the pollsters. Polling was brought to a fine art just before the United States entered the Second World War. Americans, unbeknown to themselves, were conditioned to look upon Germany and Japan as dangerous enemies who had to be stopped. In a sense, this was true, and that makes conditioned thinking all the more dangerous because based on the information fed to them, the enemy did indeed appear to be Germany and Japan. Just recently, we saw how well Tavistock's conditioning process works when Americans were conditioned to perceive Iraq as a threat and Saddam Hussein as a personal enemy of the United States. Such a conditioning process is technically described as the message reaching the sense organs of persons to be influenced. One of the most respected of all pollsters is Committee of 300 member Daniel Yankelovich of the company Yankelovich, Skelly, and White. Yankelovich is proud to tell his students that polling is a tool to change public opinion, although this is not original, Yankelovich having drawn his inspiration from David Naisbitt's book, Trend Report, which was commissioned by the Club of Rome. In his book, Naisbitt describes all of the techniques used by public opinion makers to bring about the public opinion desired by the Committee of 300. Public opinion making is the jewel in the crown of the Olympians, for with their thousands of new science social scientists at their beck and call, and with the news media firmly in their hands, new public opinions on almost any subject can be created and disseminated around the world in a matter of 2 weeks. This is precisely what happened when their servant George Bush was ordered to make war on Iraq. Within 2 weeks, not only the U.S., but almost the entire world public opinion was turned against Iraq and its president Saddam Hussein. These media change artists and news manipulators report directly to the Club of Rome, which in turn reports to the Committee of 300, at whose head sits the Queen of England, ruling over a vast network of closely linked corporations who never pay taxes and are answerable to no one, who fund their research institutions through foundations whose joint activities have almost total control over our daily lives. Together with their interlocking companies, insurance business, banks, finance corporations, oil companies, newspapers, magazines, radio, and television, this vast apparatus sits astride the United States and the world. There is not a politician in Washington, D.C. who is not, somehow, beholden to it. The left rails against it, calling it imperialism, which indeed it is. But the left is run by the same people, the very same ones who control the right, so that the left is no more free than we are. Scientists engaged in the process of conditioning are called social engineers, or new science social scientists, and they play an integral part in what we see, hear, and read. The old-school social engineers were Kurt K. Lewin, Professor Hadley Cantrell, Margaret Mead, Professor Derwin Cartwright, and Professor Lipset, who, together with John Rawlings Rees, made up the backbone of new science scientists at Tavistock Institute. During the Second World War, there were over 100 researchers at work under the direction of Kurt Lewin, copying slavishly the methods adopted by Reinhard Heydrich of the SS. The OSS was based on Heydrich's methodology, and, as we know, the OSS was the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency. The point of all this is that the governments of Britain and the United States already have the machinery in place to bring us into line in a new world order with only a slight modicum of resistance materializing, and this machinery has been in place since 1946. Each passing year has added new refinements. It is this Committee of 300 which has established control networks and mechanisms far more binding than anything ever seen in this world. Chains and ropes are not needed to restrain us. Our fear of what is to come does that job far more efficiently than any physical means of restraint. We have been brainwashed to give up our constitutional right to bear arms, to give up our Constitution itself, to allow the United Nations to exercise control over our foreign policies and the IMF to take control of our fiscal and monetary policies, to permit the president to break United States law with impunity and to invade a foreign country and kidnap its head of state. In short, we have been brainwashed to the extent where we, as a nation, will accept each and every lawless act carried out by our government almost without question. I, for one, know that we will soon have to fight to reclaim our country from the committee or lose it forever. But when it comes right down to it, how many will actually take up arms? In 1776, only 3% of the populace took up arms against King George III. This time around, 3% will be woefully inadequate. We should not allow ourselves to be led down dead-end roads, for that is what our mind controllers have planned for us by confronting us with such a complexity of issues that we simply succumb to long-range penetration and make no decisions at all on many vital issues. We shall be looking at the names of those who make up the Committee of 300, but before we do that, we should examine the massive interfacing of all important institutions, companies, and banks under the committee's control. We must mark them well because these are the people who are deciding who shall live and who shall be eliminated as useless eaters, where we will worship God, what we must wear, and even what we shall eat. According to Brzezinski, we shall be under endless surveillance around the clock for 365 days a year ad infinitum. That we have been betrayed from within is being accepted by more and more people each year. And that is good, because it is through knowledge, a word translated from the word belief, that we shall be able to defeat the enemies of all mankind. While we were being distracted by the bogeymen in the Kremlin, the Trojan horse was moved into position in Washington, D.C. The greatest danger free people face today is not from Moscow, but from Washington, D.C. We need first to conquer the domestic enemy, and after that we will be strong enough to mount an offensive to remove communism from the earth together with all of its attendant isms. The Carter administration accelerated the collapse of our economy and our military strength, the latter begun by Club of Rome and Lucis Trust member Robert Strange McNamara. In spite of his promises, Reagan continued to undermine our industrial base, starting where Carter left off. While we need to keep our defenses strong, we cannot do that from a weak industrial base for, without a well-run military-industrial complex, we cannot have a viable defense system. The Committee of 300 recognizes this and planned from 1953 its zero-growth post-industrial policies, now in full flower. Thanks to the Club of Rome, our technology potential has dropped below that of Japan and Germany. nations we are supposed to have defeated in the Second World War. How has this come about? Because of men like Dr. Alexander King and our blindfolded state of mind, we have failed to recognize the destruction of our educational institutions and systems of teaching. As a result of our blindness, we are no longer training engineers and scientists in sufficient numbers to keep us among the industrialized nations of the world. Thanks to Dr. King, a man very few people in America know about, education in the U.S. is at its lowest level since 1786. Statistics produced by the Institute for Higher Learning show that the reading and writing capabilities of high school children, the United States, are lower than they were among high school children in 1786. What we face today is not only the loss of our freedom and the very fabric of our nation, but far worse, the possibility of the loss of our souls. The steady chipping away at the foundation upon which this republic rests has left an empty void, which Satanists and cultists are rushing to fill with their synthetic soul material. This truth is difficult to accept and appreciate because there was nothing sudden about these events. If a sudden shock were to hit us, a cultural and religious shock, we would be shaken out of our apathy. But gradualism, which is what Fabianism is, does nothing to raise the alarm. Because the vast majority of Americans can see no motivation for the things I have described, they cannot accept it, and so the conspiracy is scorned and often mocked. By creating chaos through presenting hundreds of daily choices our people have to make, we have come down to a position where, unless motivation can be clearly shown, all information is rejected. This is both the weak and the strong link in the conspiratorial chain. Most thrust aside anything that has no motive, so the conspirators feel safe behind the ridicule poured upon those who point to the coming crisis in our nation and our individual lives. However, if we can get enough people to see the truth, the motivation block gets weaker until it will eventually be forced aside as more and more people become enlightened and the notion that this cannot happen in America is dispensed with. The Committee of 300 is counting on our maladaptive responses to govern our reaction to created events, and it will not be disappointed as long as we as a nation continue in the present way we respond. We must turn responses to created crises into adaptive responses by identifying the conspirators and exposing their plans for us, so that these things become public knowledge. The Club of Rome has already made the transition to barbarism. Instead of waiting to be raptured, we must stop the Committee of 300 before it can accomplish its goal of making us prisoners of the new dark age planned for us. It is not up to God, it is up to us. We have to take the necessary action. All information that I provide in this book comes from years of research backed up by impeccable intelligence sources. Nothing is exaggerated. It is factual and precise, so do not fall into the trap set by the enemy that this material is disinformation. For the past 2 decades, I have provided information which has proved to be highly accurate and which has explained a lot of puzzling events. My hope is that through this book, a better, clearer, and wider understanding of the conspiratorial forces ranged against this nation will come about. That hope is being realized as more and more young people are beginning to ask questions and seek information about what is really going on. It is difficult for people to comprehend that these conspirators are real and that they have the power I and many others have attributed to them. Many have written to ask how it is that our government does nothing about the terrible threat to civilization. The problem is that our government is part of the problem, part of the conspiracy, and nowhere and at no time has this become more clearly evident than during the Bush presidency. Of course, President Bush knows precisely what the Committee of 300 is doing to us. He works for them. Others have written to say, "We thought we were fighting the government." Of course we are, but behind government stands a force so powerful and all-encompassing that intelligence agencies are even afraid to mention the name Olympians. Proof of the Committee of 300 is found in the vast number of powerful institutions owned and controlled by it. Listed here are some of the more important ones, all of which come under the mother of all think tanks and research institutions, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, with its far-flung network of hundreds of branches. Stanford Research Center. Stanford Research Center, SRC, was founded in 1946 by the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. Stanford was created to help Robert Zero, Anderson and his Arco Oil Company, who had secured for the Committee of 300 the oil rights on the North Slope of Alaska. Basically, the job was too large for Anderson's Aspen Institute to handle, so a new center had to be founded and funded. That new center was Stanford Research Center. Alaska sold its rights on a down payment of $900 million, a relatively small amount for the Committee of 300. The governor of Alaska was steered to SRI for help and advice. This was no accident but the result of judicious planning and a process of long-range conditioning. Following the governor's call for help, 3 SRI scientists set up shop in Alaska, where they met with the Alaskan Secretary of State and the State Planning Office. Francis Grehan, who headed the SRI team, assured the governor that his problem of how to handle the rich oil find would be safe in the hands of SRI. Naturally, Grehan did not mention the Committee of 300 or the Club of Rome. In less than a month, Grehan assembled a team of economists, petroleum scientists, and new science scientists numbering in the hundreds. The report SRI gave to the governor ran to 88 pages. The proposal was adopted virtually without change by the Alaska legislature in 1970. Grehan had indeed done a remarkable job for the Committee of 300. From this beginning, SRI developed into an institution employing 4,000 people with an annual budget of $160 million plus. Its president, Charles A. Anderson, has seen much of this growth during his tenure, as has Professor Willis Harman, director of the SRI Center for the Study of Social Policies, employing hundreds of new scientists, many of the top staffers having been transferred from Tavistock's London base. One of those was RCA board chairman and former British intelligence agent David Sarnoff, who was closely involved with Harman and his team for 25 years. Sarnoff was something of a watchdog for the Mother Institute in Sussex. Stanford claims to make no moral judgments on projects it accepts, working for Israel and the Arabs, South Africa, and Libya, but, as one would imagine, by adopting this attitude, it ensures an inside edge with foreign governments that the CIA has found most useful. In Jim Ridgway's book, The Closed Corporation, SRI spokesman Gibson brags about SRI's non-discriminatory stance. Although not on the Federal Contract Research Center lists, SRI is today the largest military think tank, dwarfing Hudson and Rand. Among SRL's specialty departments are chemical and biological warfare experimental centers. One of Stanford's more dangerous activities is counterinsurgency operations aimed at civilian populations, just the sort of 1,984 inches things government is already using against its own people. The U.S. government pays SRI millions of dollars each year for this kind of highly controversial research. Following student protests against chemical warfare experiments conducted at Stanford, SRI sold itself to a private group for just $25 million. Of course, nothing really changed. SRI was still a Tavistock project, and the Committee of 300 still owned it, but the gullible appeared to be satisfied by this meaningless cosmetic change. In 1958, a startling new development arose. Advanced Research Products Agency, ARPA, a contracting agency for the Defense Department, approached SRI with a top-secret proposal. John Foster at the Pentagon told SRI that what was needed was a program to ensure the United States against technological surprise. Foster wanted to perfect a condition where the environment became a weapon. Special bombs to trigger volcanoes and/or earthquakes. Behavioral research on potential enemies and minerals and metals with potential for new weapons. The project was accepted by SRI and codenamed Shaky. The massive electronic brain in Shaky was capable of carrying out many commands, its computers having been constructed by IBM for SRI. 28 scientists worked on what is called human augmentation. The IBM computer even has the capability to solve problems by analogy and recognizes and identifies scientists who work with it. The special applications of this tool can be better imagined than described. Brzezinski knew what he was talking about when he wrote, the technotronic era. Stanford Research Institute works closely with scores of civilian consulting firms trying to apply military technology to domestic situations. This has not always been a success, but as techniques improve, the prospects for massive, all-pervading surveillance, as described by Brzezinski, daily becomes more real. It already exists and is in use, even though slight malfunctions from time to time have to be ironed out. One such civilian consulting firm was Schriever McKee Associates of McLean, Virginia, run by retired General Bernard A. Schriever, a former chief of the Air Force Systems Command, who developed the Titan, Thor, Atlas, and Minuteman rockets. Schriever put together a consortium of Lockheed, Emerson Electric, Northrop, Control Data, Raytheon, and TRW under the name of Urban Systems Associates, Inc. The purpose of the consortium? To solve social and psychological urban problems by means of military techniques using advanced electronic systems. It is interesting to note that TRW became the largest credit information collecting company in the credit reporting business as a result and an outcome of its work with Urban Systems Associates, Inc. This should tell us a great deal about just how far this nation is already under total surveillance, which is the first requirement of the Committee of 300. No dictatorship, especially not one on a global scale, can function without total control over each and every individual. SRI was well on its way to becoming a key Committee of 300 research organization. By the 1980 ES, 60% of SRL's contracts were devoted to futurism with both military and civilian applications. Its major clients were the U.S. Department of Defense Directorate of Defense Research and Engineering, Office of Aerospace Research, which dealt with applications of the behavioral sciences to research management, Executive Office of the President, Office of Science and Technology, U.S. Department of Health. On behalf of the Department of Health, SRI ran a program called Patterns in ESDA Title I Reading Achievement Tests. Other clients were the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Transportation, and the National Science Foundation, NSF. Of significance was the paper developed for NSF, entitled Assessment of Future and International Problems. Stanford Research, under the tutelage of Tavistock Institute in London, put together a far-reaching and chilling system it called Business Intelligence Program. In excess of 600 companies in the U.S. and abroad became subscribers. The program covered research in Japanese foreign business relations, consumer marketing in a period of change, the mounting challenge of international terrorism, sensory evaluation in consumer products, electronic funds transfer system, optoelectric sensing, exploratory planning methods, the U.S. defense industry, and capital availability. Among the top committee of 300 companies who became clients of this program were Bechtel Corporation. George Shultz was on its board. Hewlett-Packard, TRW, Bank of America, Shell Company, RCA, Blythe, Eastman Dillon, Saga Foods Corporation, McDonnell Douglas, Crown Zellerbach, Wells Fargo Bank, and Kaiser Industries. But one of the most sinister of all SRI programs with the possibilities of doing tremendous damage in altering the direction in which the United States will go, socially, morally, and religiously, was Stanford's Charles F. Kettering Foundation's Changing Images of Man, under Stanford official reference, contract number URH 489, 2150 Policy Research Report, number April 4th, 74, prepared by the SRI Center for the Study of Social Policy, Director Willis Harman. This is probably one of the most far-reaching investigations into how man might be changed that has ever been conducted. The report, covering 319 pages, was written by 14 new science scientists under the supervision of Tavistock and 23 top controllers including B.F. Skinner, Margaret Mead, Irvin Laszlo, and Sir Geoffrey Vickers, a high-level British intelligence officer in M16. It will be recalled that his son-in-law, Sir Peter Vickers Hall, was a founding member of the so-called Conservative Heritage Foundation. Much of the 3,000 pages of recommendations given to the Reagan administration in January 1981 were based upon material taken from Willis Harman's Changing Images of Man. I was privileged to receive a copy of The Changing Images of Man from my intelligence colleagues 5 days after it was accepted by the United States government. What I read shocked me, as I realized I was looking at a blueprint for a future America, unlike anything I had ever seen before. The nation was to be programmed to change and become so accustomed to such planned changes that it would hardly be noticeable when profound changes did occur. We have gone downhill so fast since The Aquarian Conspiracy, the book title of Willis Harman's technical paper, was written, that today, divorce draws no stigma, suicide is at an all-time high and raises few eyebrows, social deviations from the norm and sexual aberrations, once unmentionable in decent circles, are now commonplace and excite no special protest. As a nation, we have not noticed how Changing Images of Mankind has radically altered our American way of life forever. Somehow we were overcome by the Watergate syndrome. For a while, we were shocked and dismayed to learn that Nixon was nothing but a cheap crook who hobnobbed with Earl Warren's mafia friends at the beautiful home they built for him adjoining the Nixon estate. When too many future shocks and news headlines demanded our attention, we lost our way, or rather, the huge number of choices with which we were and still are daily confronted, confused us to such a degree that we were no longer able to make the necessary choices. Worse yet, having been subjected to a barrage of crimes in high places, plus the trauma of the Vietnam War, our nation seemed no longer to want truths. Such reaction is carefully explained in Willis Harman's technical paper. In short, the American nation was reacting exactly as profiled. Worse yet, in not wishing to accept truth, we took matters a step further. We looked to government to shield us from the truth. The corrupt stench of the Reagan-Bush administrations we wanted covered with 6 feet of earth. The crimes committed under the title of Iran-Contra affair, or scandals, we didn't want uncovered. We let our president lie to us regarding his whereabouts in the period October 20th, 23rd, 1980. Yet these crimes far exceed in quantity and scope anything Nixon did while he was in office. Do we as a nation recognize it as going downhill with our brakes off? No, we do not. When those whose business it is to bring the truth to the American people that a private, well-organized little government inside the White House was busy committing one crime after another, crimes which attacked the very soul of this nation and the Republican institutions upon which it rested, we were told not to bother the public with such things. "We really don't want to know about all this speculation," became a standard response. When the highest elected official of the land blatantly put UN law above the Constitution of the United States, an impeachable offense, the majority accepted it as normal. When the highest elected official of the land went to war without a congressional declaration of war, the fact was censored out by the news media, and again, we accepted it rather than face the truth. When the Gulf War, which our president plotted and planned, began, not only were we happy with censorship of the most blatant kind, we even took it to our hearts, believing that it was good to the war effort. Our president lied, April Glaspie lied, the State Department lied. They said the war was justified because President Hussein had been warned to leave Kuwait alone. When Glaspie's cables to the State Department were finally made public, one United States senator after another went charging to defend Glaspie, the harlot. It mattered not that they came from both the Democrats and the Republicans. We, the people, let them get away with their vile lies. In this public attitude of the American people, the wildest dreams of Willis Harman and his teams of scientists became a reality. The Tavistock Institute was elated at its success in destroying the self-respect and self-esteem of this once great nation. We are told that we won the Gulf War. What is not yet perceived by the vast majority of Americans is that, in winning the war, it cost the self-respect and honor of our nation. That lies rotting in the desert sands of Kuwait and Iraq, alongside the corpses of the Iraqi soldiers we butchered in the agreed retreat from Kuwait and Basra. We could not keep our word that we would abide by the Geneva Conventions and not attack them. "What do you want?" our controllers asked us. Victory or self-respect? You can't have both. 100 years ago, this could not have happened, but now it has happened and excites no comment. We have succumbed to the long-range penetration warfare waged against this nation by Tavistock. Like the German nation, defeated by the Prudential Bombing Survey, enough of us have succumbed to make this nation the kind that totalitarian regimes of the past would have only envisaged in their dreams. Here, they would say, is a nation, one of the largest in the world, that doesn't want the truth. All of our propaganda agencies can be dispensed with. We don't have to struggle to keep the truth from this nation. They have willingly rejected it of their own volition. This nation is a pushover. Our once proud Republic of the United States of America became no more than a series of criminal front organizations, which history shows is always the start of totalitarianism. This is the stage of permanent alteration we are at in America as 1991 drew to a close. We live in a throwaway society, programmed not to last. We do not even flinch at the 4 million homeless, nor the 30 million jobless, nor the 15 million babies murdered thus far. They are throwaways of the age of Aquarius, a conspiracy so damnable that, when first confronted with it, the majority will disavow its existence, rationalizing these events as times have changed. This is how the Tavistock Institute and Willis Harman programmed us to react. Dismantling of our ideals goes on without protest. The spiritual and intellectual drive of our people has been destroyed. On May 27, 1991, President Bush made a very profound statement, the thrust of which appears to have been totally misused by most political commentators. The moral dimension of American policy requires us to chart a moral course through a world of lesser evils. That is the real world, not black and white. Very few moral absolutes. What else could we expect from a president who is most probably the most evil man ever to occupy the White House? Consider this in the light of his order to the military to bury alive 12,000 Iraqi soldiers. Consider this in the light of his ongoing war of genocide against the Iraqi people. President Bush was delighted to characterize President Saddam Hussein as the Hitler of our times. He never bothered to offer a single scrap of proof. It was not needed. Because President Bush made the statement, we accepted it without question. Consider this in the bright light of truth, that he did all of these things in the name of the American people while secretly taking his orders from the Committee of 300. But more than anything else, consider this. President Bush and his controllers feel so secure that they no longer deem it necessary to hide their evil control of the American people or to lie about it. This is self-evident in the statement that he, as our leader, will make all manner of compromises with truth, honesty, and decency if his controllers, and ours, deem it necessary. On May 27, 1991, the President of the United States abandoned each and every principle embodied in our Constitution and boldly proclaimed that he was no longer bound by it. This is a great victory for the Tavistock Institute and the Prudential Bombing Survey, whose target changed from German worker housing in 1945 to the soul of the American people in a war that began in 1946 and runs through to 1992. Increased pressure on this nation for change was applied by Stanford Research Institute in the early 1960 SSRL's offensive gathered power and momentum. Switch on your television set and you will see Stanford's victory in front of your very eyes. Talk shows featuring heavy sexual details, special video channels where perversion, rock and roll, and drugs reign supreme. Where once John Wayne ruled, we now have a made-over apology for a man, or is he, called Michael Jackson, a parody of a human being who is held up as a hero, as he gyrates, shuffles, mumbles, and screams his way across television screens in millions of American homes. A woman who has been through a series of marriages gets national coverage. One filthy, half-washed, drug-ridden, decadent rock band after another has hours of airtime devoted to its inane sounds and mad gyrations, clothes fashions, and language aberrations. Soap operas showing as near as damn it is to wearing pornographic scenes draw no comment. Whereas in early 1960 this would never have been tolerated, today it is accepted as normal. We have been subjected and we have succumbed to what Tavistock Institute calls future shocks, whose future is now, and we are so numbed by one cultural shock after another that to protest seems like a futile gesture, and, therefore, logically we think, it does no good to protest. In 1986, the Committee of 300 ordered the pressure turned up. The U.S. was not going down fast enough. The United States began the process of recognizing the butchers of Cambodia, the criminal Pol Pot regime, self-confessors to the murder of 2 million Cambodian citizens. In 1991, the wheel turned the full circle. The United States went to war against a friendly nation that had been programmed to trust the Washington traitors. We accused President Hussein of the small nation of Iraq of all manner of evil, none of which was even remotely true. We killed and maimed its children. We left them to starve and to die of all manner of diseases.